What do people in Europe really think about human rights? In 2019, the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights undertook a major survey and asked 35,000 people from 29 countries about their views on fundamental rights. 9 in 10 of you agree human rights are important for creating a fairer society.
9 in 10.
More than 3 in 5 of you do think human rights can play a useful role in your lives. Should we be concerned? The following answers reveal some stark differences in what people think about human rights. 68% of you think some people take unfair advantage of human rights.
68%.
But only 27% of you who are better off think this. And 27% of you think judges in Europe are not independent.
27.
And you? Do you really think this is acceptable? Let's think about those figures. Let's use them for protecting our fundamental rights, for building a fairer society.
Five, 4.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the second day of our series of events at the European Union Fundamental Rights Agency in cooperation with the Croatian Presidency of the Council of the EU and the EEA and Norway grants. Now, yesterday, as you know, we unpicked FRA's survey into what fundamental rights mean to the people of the European Union. You've just seen a video summarizing those. Today we're going to dig even deeper and look at something which is really, really topical right now, and that is data protection, privacy, in the context in particular of health. We've got a really interesting debate ahead of us, but first, for some welcoming words, I'm going to go to Norway's State Secretary, Jens Frølich Holte.
Thank you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today over a video link. As we are all being very accustomed to do these days. I'm very happy to be here. This conference is a part of the collaboration between the FRA and the EEA grants. The main goals of the EEA grants are quite wide-reaching. They are supposed to strengthen bilateral cooperation and reduce disparities in the beneficiary countries. And with these grants, the donors, which is Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, we finance thousands of projects led by NGOs in 14 countries in Europe. The total budget exceeding 200 million euros, of which at least 1/3 shall be allocated to democracy and human rights projects. Respect for individual rights and freedoms is essential for a functioning democracy. The Norwegian government has made rights and freedom a core part of our foreign policy. And even if we are in the middle of a pandemic, we will keep this as a priority and also include it in our COVID-19 response internationally. We are concerned for the backsliding of fundamental rights that we observe in some of the EU member states, both in general and, of course, in particular now during the COVID-19 crisis. This tendency puts at risk the necessary trust in which bilateral and international cooperation has been built upon. And according to the survey that's being launched, we really cannot take for granted broad popular support in all countries of Europe for the principles of human rights. 1/3 of those asked agree that the only people to benefit from human rights are those who don't deserve it. I'd say that's quite an extraordinary find. Mm-hmm. It's also very discouraging that the fact that a large number of citizens do not acknowledge that persons belonging to minorities should be entitled to the same rights and freedom as enjoyed by the majority. I mean, what European history has taught us all through the Renaissance, Enlightenment, and also from the horrors that we saw during World War II. That's the importance and the importance of equal access to justice and of protection from violation of our fundamental rights. So in a sense, it's not only fundamental rights that we're talking about, it's really true and historic European values that we need to stand up for. So we have a very important job to do. I think we must find ways to communicate better how human rights are relevant to each and one of us. And it must happen before those rights and freedom come under pressure. The challenge is that we act too late, that we voice our concern when when rights and freedoms are being curbed. And, once access to information is limited and freedoms of assembly and association are gone, it's very difficult to have influence. So awareness of human rights, it is increasingly important on a European level and also in Norway's foreign policy. So I really welcome the report that the Fundamental Rights Agency is launching here now. Of course, human rights is a topic full of dilemmas, interesting discussions, and they are becoming more prominent in the light of COVID-19. For Norway, the bottom line is that any extraordinary measures introduced in order to combat the virus must be proportional and limited in time, and it must be weighted against other potential consequences for people and society at large. I wanted to highlight two dilemmas involving technologies that's particularly relevant to the situation where we find ourselves today. The first dilemma is related to the use of surveillance technology to limit infections. Using track and tracing apps surely is a very effective way of responding to this pandemic and also future pandemic, but there is a risk of disproportionate interference in user privacy. And even a potential for abuse. So Norway had a track and tracing app. It was introduced in spring very quickly, and it was paused quite recently in the wake of a statement by the Norwegian Data Protection Authority, and they said that the app interferes disproportionately in user privacy because we have a very low transmission rate in Norway now, which is a very good thing. So the success in handling COVID-19 in Norway also meant that the legal basis for the app could be questioned. So the Public Health Institute paused it, and now we're looking at other ways to do it more properly. But in any case, we still have the app in place, not actively being used, but it shows that these dilemmas are very much alive in the situation we're handling now. The second dilemma, which I wanted to mention, concerns increased flow of dis and misinformation related to the pandemic. There is a big debate on how, if you should limit freedom of speech and media. The OSCE Media Freedom Representative has in a number of cases expressed concern for unproportionate measures justified by the need to prevent spread of disinformation and misinformation. But if the real motivation is to curb independent voices, this becomes hugely problematic. While disinformation about the situation can kill, reliable information will save lives. So I think it's more important than ever to fight disinformation and to support independent journalism. And social media might also be used to reinforce the spread of misinformation, which also puts a big responsibility on us as individuals, not to contribute to dissemination, not to like or share misinformation and disinformation. And we need a collective push to raise public awareness on this responsibility, the responsibility we actually have as citizens. So these are demanding times. Hopefully the current situation will teach us some lessons and make it easier to sort out the dilemmas in the future. But I'm convinced that a democratic system of governance based on sound power sharing principles, based on transparency and public trust, will lead to good outcomes in fighting the pandemic. And I think if you are in doubt, you can look at the numbers around the world, and you can see that the transparent democracies are in fact doing a very good job in combating what is a very demanding situation with the pandemic. Full transparency and openness from day one was a crucial aspect in stopping the spread in Norway. We have had a lot of dialogue with local governments. Our cabinet ministers have been very accessible. We've had daily press briefings. We have tried to create a trust between governments on all levels and citizens, which we believe has made us better equipped to overcome the crisis. But sound power sharing principles and public trust, it does not appear overnight. It has emerged stepwise and piecewise throughout the centuries into a kind of a fine-masked system of governance, which I believe is a very true European value, to have a democratic, transparent system of governance where there is strong trust between the government and the voters, the people. And I think that's the strongest weapon that we as Europeans can have in the fight against the virus. And of course, we are waiting for a vaccine, which will hopefully appear. But our system of governance is also a very key component. So I just wanted to end by saying that we appreciate the close cooperation we have with FRA and the other EU institutions and member states on these issues. We note and support that rule of law, human rights and democracy is a priority also for the next 3 chairmanships of the EU. From Norway's side, we aim to do more and strengthen the rule of law and fundamental rights, and we are very happy that we are a partner of the FRA in this important work. So I'm looking forward to following the discussions this morning, and thank you for your attention.
Jens Frølich, Holte, thank you very much for those words. You've outlined very nicely some of the discussions we are going to be having today, and some of the dilemmas facing many European countries with the issue of how to protect rights and tackle this pandemic. Now, no fundamental rights agency event would be complete without a few words from its director, Michael O'Flaherty. Now, he can't be with us in person today, but he has recorded a message. So before we go into the debate proper, let's just hear from him.
Hello, welcome to day 2 of the Fundamental Rights Agency conference, rolling out the findings of our Fundamental Rights Survey. The views of 35,000 people in 29 countries regarding what role human rights can and should play in their lives, in their countries. We asked them a whole range of questions about every aspect of their lives, including their attitude to tech from a human rights point of view. That's our focus today. We're coming right up to the present minute and looking at the role technology plays in our lives and what the rulebook is, what the rulebook needs to be regarding respecting human rights, privacy, freedom of expression, freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, what it must look like today, including in the immediate context, of course, of COVID-19. As some of you will know, the Fundamental Rights Agency launched a bulletin on the topic of COVID-19, human rights and tech just a few weeks ago. And we saw there's some real value in, for example, tracing applications, but nevertheless a need for them to be rolled out in full respect for the fundamental legal principles of necessity, proportionality, non-discrimination, and most basic of all, legality. But let me leave it there. We've got a fantastic panel lined up today to discuss these issues from every possible dimension. We also invite you to participate through the various means we're making available. Enjoy the conference. Thank you for joining us.
for those kind words. Now it's time to get our panel discussion underway. The aim is to unpick the statistics in this report, to ask questions about how we can protect fundamental rights, human rights, protect our own personal data, and at the same time face up to public health crises. And of course, as we know, and the reason we're having this debate virtually is we're in the middle of one of those at the moment. Now, we have a fantastic set of panelists to discuss this. We have Clayton Hamilton from the World Health Organization, its Digital Health Division. We have Wojciech Wiewiórowski, who is Europe's Data Protection Supervisor, Max Schrems of the European Centre for Digital Rights, and Cornelia Kutterer of Microsoft, Digital Privacy and Regulatory Policies in the European Union. And of course, we have David Reichel, Project Manager at the Fundamental Rights Agency. And we're going to ask you to speak first, David, to first of all highlight some of the key findings of your report.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. So it's my pleasure to give you a very quick overview of some of the main findings of our report on data protection and privacy, which was just published and is based on the Fundamental Rights Survey. As was mentioned yesterday, the Fundamental Rights Survey covered 35,000 people in the EU, in North Macedonia, and in the United Kingdom, and it's representative of the general population aged 16 years or older. And it covers several areas of fundamental human rights in the EU. One of the areas of the questions we asked people included questions linked to data protection and privacy. And the report that was published covered selected findings of these questions. So I would like to give a quick overview and also share my impressions when doing the analysis. And I think in general, we have quite positive results when it comes to data protection in the EU in there. However, there were also some surprising results. And of course, there are some issues that need particular attention. Let me highlight 5 points. First of all, related to the willingness of shared personal data. Obviously, and not surprisingly, the willingness to share data depends on the type of information people should share. People find it much easier to share information related to their address, citizenship, or date of birth as compared to information linked to, for example, grounds of discrimination such as sexual orientation, religion or belief, or political views. I found it striking that it's only 7% of people in the EU would be willing to share their political views, data on political views with governments, and only 5% with private companies. And not surprisingly, people are really reluctant to share data linked to biometric information, such as their fingerprint or facial images. However, it's important to keep in mind there is a certain share in the population that is not willing to share any of those data. 23% would not willing to share any of those data with public administration, 41% with private companies. The second point is linked to knowledge of rights. I think here we really have good results. Many people are aware of the general data, the GDPR, which I think is one of the most famous pieces of legislation in the EU. And also many people are aware of their rights, for example, to access their personal data. However, we also observe a strong variation across countries, and in several countries, the majority is still not aware of these basic rights. The third point, and here I would also like to show you a slide, if this can be shown by tech, is linked to tech skills. So apart from the awareness of your rights, some people just don't know, for example, how to check the privacy settings on their smartphone. So it's only so it is 24%, 1 in 4 does not know how to check the privacy on any of their apps on their smartphone. Relatedly, and also linked to the discussion now on contact tracing apps, it is 1 in 5, 19% in the EU don't know how to switch off the location settings on their smartphone. And this, obviously, there's also a variation across countries, where in all the countries, at least 1 in 10 does not know how to do this on their phones. Next point, now we can stop sharing the slides, is linked to trust and concerns. And I was surprised to see that there is much more trust in governments as compared to private companies. This result is consistently throughout different questions, different type of information. We heard in the panel yesterday that now during the crisis, the level of trust in governments is higher than ever before. But it also needs to be kept in mind that this survey and data were collected before the crisis. So this issue appeared already before. People have concerns that the data are used without the knowledge. Obviously, most of them, 55% for people who are engaged in crime and fraud. But the second point is already 31% concerned that advertisers or businesses use the data without their concern, just followed by foreign governance. And the last point I would like to make is linked to gender. We do find in some of the questions on data protection a gender difference, with women showing somewhat lower awareness of how to check the privacy on their smartphones and how to switch off locations settings. And there's also awareness of rights. There's a gap between men and women. It's not a huge gap, but it's a significant gap. And I see that gender is not always present in discussions around data protection. So these are just a few takeaways from the Fundamental Rights Survey. Our rather short report presents you with several statistics, but obviously rarely statistics speak for themselves. So, and especially in the context of important societal challenges, I think it's an important basis for policy discussions. And I really look forward to hear what the panelists have to say and interpret these statistics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David Reichel, for that overview of the key findings. Clayton Hamilton of the World Health Organization, I'm going to come to you first because I do know that unfortunately you have to leave us a bit earlier than the rest. Now, 23% of people in the European Union don't, it seems, want to share any personal data, not even their date of birth, not even their address. That's really quite a challenge at a time when governments are asking their populations to share information on public health grounds. What do you think governments can do? You know, how can they use these technologies without compromising data protection and privacy?
Thanks very much, Imogen. And let me say that let me start by saying that since the beginning of the COVID-19 outbreak, United Nations human rights officials, the WHO Director General and the Regional Director for Europe have been stressing the importance of protecting the right to health for all people. And in no area is this message more pertinent than in the domain of digital health. So what we have actually seen in the COVID-19 pandemic is an unprecedented call for digital technologies to be employed by countries in supporting national and international public health response actions. Digital health has in fact proven to be invaluable in bolstering the ability of health systems and primary healthcare to cope with the massive surge scenarios, and at the same time in maintaining the continuity and delivery of essential health services. We've also seen that new modalities of public health surveillance and dissemination of key public health information have opened up and received wide acceptance by populations. So essentially, we are already seeing digital health employed by member states across a wide range of contexts in responding to COVID-19, from awareness and prevention through diagnosis and diagnostics to supporting the relaxation of public health and social measures. Now, the question that you've posed, Imogen, really about how can governments use technologies without infringing on the fundamental rights of people? And there are a number of very concerted actions that we can take. Firstly, what we're really talking about is underlying issues of trust and digital literacy. So as we've seen from the statistics in the report, we're talking about 1 in 5, close to 1 in 4 individuals who are unwilling to share their information. And so right away, that suggests to us that there is underlying issues of trust in the use of technology. And I would tend to suggest that there are also literacy issues, not really understanding exactly where data is stored in technology, how it's secured, and also from the government's perspective, insufficient communication about how that takes place. So really, what we need is to have a mandate that technologies such as the track and trace or digital contact tracing tools, which have recently gained much prominence and notoriety, should only be used for the purpose of conducting anonymized public health contact tracing and exposure notification, and that they're distributed under the guidance of national health authorities. We also can certainly see that using an operation model that is on an opt-in basis, which I'm happy to say that in the majority of European examples of digital health uses, it is in fact an opt-in basis with clear consent applied, and as the case may be, the ability for an individual to withdraw that consent should they feel the need. The systems themselves need to be designed on a basis of a fundamental principle of what we call privacy by design. And that essentially means that the very inception of the tool itself takes privacy into account. That, in the context of digital contact tracing tools, means that there's no location tracking of individuals, for example. That's a very key point to ensure that trust and privacy are in fact developed. We, of course, also need to have strict controls and measures applied to the data which is captured through contact tracing apps and other tools, and in particular have it received, stored and governed by an independent third party who has oversight and accountability for its use. And then finally, I would say an important measure is to establish criteria for sunsetting these types of tools following the peaks of the pandemic, and specify permanent deletion of data when that data is no longer used by public health authorities. So they are the main actions I believe that we can take to ensure that we can still benefit from the technologies being introduced without infringing on the fundamental rights of people.
Okay, just to follow up there, because I'm sitting in the country Switzerland where the app is being rolled out today, and we all got a little notification on our phones this morning. Welcome to the app, please. It's voluntary, please download it. It appears to tick all the boxes that you outlined there, and yet I know many people here who are saying, no way, I'm not going to do that. So, I mean, can these apps be useful if a significant proportion of the population just don't want to use them?
Thank you. Yes, and I think that's a really important point. And in fact, there's been a lot of conjecture and discussion in the media about the level of adoption of these types of tools. And I've seen figures ranging from 30% right up to 80% of adoption quoted as being required for them to deliver a public health utility. And I would say that's a misconception and something that we need to really address carefully. So firstly, if we look at the evidence and research that's being done, and I'm in particular referring to research that was done by the University of Oxford, where they've actually predicted how the use of an app might reduce a virus's reproduction number. So reducing that value of R0 or R0 to less than 1. And how it would impact how many people would essentially catch the virus from infection. What they, in fact, found that if about 56% of the population, or about 80% of all smartphone users, which is a very high level, use this app, it alone could reduce the number from a value of roughly 3 right down to less than the number of 1. Now, this model and the research that they were doing actually assumed that people over the age of 70 remained in lockdown situation and that no traditional contact tracing was underway. So I think there's a very large margin for error. What we really have seen that the media have picked up on this type of research and have in fact restated as being that there will be no impact seen until you reach these levels of 60, 56, 60%. And that is in fact not true. We can actually, I think, say now with some confidence that there's utilities actually gained at much less values. And if we have numbers that are simply around double-digit figures, I think we're actually going to see some benefit from the use. Obviously, it is the case that the greater percentage of the population that trusts and adopts and use these tools, then obviously the greater public health impact that they will have. But it's certainly not the case that we need unrealistically high levels of adoption for them to return any value.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we will almost certainly return to the pandemic and the app later in the discussion, but you outlined some of the concerns that people have, Clayton, and they are around data protection. So I'd like to turn to you, Wojciech Wiewiórowski, because the GDPR is one of the key legislative things that we've had over the last few years. 69% of people in the EU have heard of it, which is great. but that does actually mean that 1 in 3 haven't. And so it would help people now, wouldn't it, if they knew about this legislation when they're thinking about this app. It would help if they knew what their data protection rights are. So why do you think 1 in 3 have not heard of it?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation here, but also thank you for the question that you are asking. Because I have to say that last 2 years we were rather accused of talking about GDPR too often and make it too much on the top of the discussion about each and every topic that is in the social dialogue. So probably the knowledge that there is still a lack of awareness about general data protection regulation is something that the data protection authorities should be very aware of, because this is their job to make this awareness higher. Of course, on the other hand, we have to say that the people are not that keen on the legislation that is providing them with the rights to defend privacy if their privacy is not in danger. So sometimes it happens that those people who were not interested in the legal protection of the data are often the people who simply do not fear or do not feel the problem itself. I think that actually the result of the survey shows quite a big awareness about GDPR itself. And also about the rights that are derived from the GDPR. So I would not be that much surprised by that. What was very important, and I'm happy that David said it in his first intervention, is that this data has not been collected during the COVID crisis, but before the COVID crisis. So actually, that would be probably good to check what are the results after the crisis or after the same time that we have this crisis situation, because this data is the starting point for what we are right now seeing during the COVID crisis. Of course, it also means that the whole trust the governments have been gained before the crisis. And of course, it differs from country to country, depending on the political situation and the general attitude of the society towards the governments themselves. That would be once again interesting to check after a while how are the attitudes of the people after this efforts that were taken by the governments, but also after the efforts that were taken by the companies or by the private business. That's something that we would be also very interested to. So I'm happy that FRA is preparing the service like that and also working further and making more researches on them. This is why the day before yesterday we have signed the memorandum of understanding between the European Data Protection Supervisor and the Fundamental Rights Agency, and I had the possibility with Michael OFlaherty to talk a while about this future kind of cooperations. I think it's also important when you think about the attitude of the people towards the privacy and the data protection. We should also say that there are no general patterns to be followed from the social point of view. I can see even in my family that the attitude towards sharing an information about himself or herself can differ even between me and my wife. And I'm probably more open to share the information than the other persons in my family. So even if we are coming from the same background, even if we are coming from the same country, even if we have a very similar education, the attitude towards the things which are personal might be very personal because they are personal. So this is intimacy that is taken in consideration here, and I hope that also Max will be able to supplement this intervention here about the awareness in Europe with the checks that were done by the civic society about.
Oh, I think we have maybe lost. Wojciech, this is the.
Okay, I'm back, but I already finished. I already finished. The last sentence was I hope that Max will be able to supplement it with the point of view of the civic society on the results.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm about to come to you, Max. However, I just wanted to say that since we've been talking about the GDPR, we've got a bit of a treat for people who are particularly interested in how that historic legislation came about. There is a film called Democratie im Woud der Daten, that's Democracy in the Blizzard of Data. And you can watch it over the next 3 days, free online access. I think if you go to the Fundamental Rights Agency's website, you will find a link to it there. Now, Max Schrems, civil society, the part that keeps everybody else on their toes about new technology and data protection. However, 1 in 3 internet users in the European Union say they never read the terms and conditions, that thing about cookies, they just click away from it without setting any preferences. They don't read, many of them, the terms and services, or if they do, and we all know how long they are, 27% say they don't understand them, and 1 in 2, half, find it difficult to consent to personal data usage. So when we come, governments, for example, to promoting applications like contact tracing, is it right if we don't know, if governments don't know that the people have properly consented?
So I was actually reading these results, and I think they're probably much worse than these numbers in reality. For example, if the question is, finding it easy to consent, it's usually pretty easy to click the big green button that says consent, but the button that says I do not want this is usually very hard to find. So I guess if in reality we would probably also look at the numbers of people actually reading privacy policies. We've oftentimes, for example, asked companies to disclose how many people actually click that link to the privacy policy when they actually say, I've read it in that moment. I think the numbers are probably way less than the 20% we have in the study, because people usually do not say, I don't read stuff. So in reality, probably people read way less than that. I think for the contact tracing stuff, and for the whole Corona situation, we had actually a very interesting situation. We were a bit ahead of the time with the apps in Austria. We had a very early app, about a month earlier than everybody else. But it was kind of like sent out there without really thinking much. It was done by the Red Cross, and they basically just sent that off. And I think what was really interesting is that here you get into this exact point that was raised before about digital literature. I'm usually trying to kind of stay away from that point because it shifts responsibility to the user oftentimes. That should oftentimes be rather with the companies. But we actually saw with the tracking companies that with the tracking apps that people just heard it's a tracking app, so they were absolutely against it. In Austria, there were about 70% of the people did not want to install an app like that. We actually reviewed the Austrian app, and it was one of the most privacy apps we've ever had on the table. We usually look at dating apps, and they have 4,000 trackers built into them. But people do not realize it because they don't know what happens behind the screen. And I think that is a point that is very important to kind of break through. It's on the one hand, for a lot of companies, they hide the terrible things that happen. So there's a stomach feeling by people that something dark is going on in the background with any app. And if an app is really very upfront and says, we are a tracing app in this case, the word tracing triggered more resistance than most of the apps that are probably way worse on the privacy side of it. So it was kind of interesting to see how there is a disconnect between what people perceive to be privacy friendly, what people understand, and how they can actually make these decisions. Which gets me to one point that I always try to raise here is we're not going to win this probably by the users. So it's going to be very hard for people to really understand how a tracing app works. I learned programming in school. I do data protection for a long while, but it took me a week or two to understand how the different tracing apps really work and what technically they really do. And even there, I realized that some things were wrong that I assumed. So it's kind of hard to shift this responsibility to users and have the informed user that makes these choices. And I think that is where we'll have to get a different system that is probably more based on data protection authorities enforcing the law, building a system where we just generally trust, digital services or apps, be it the government or the private parties, instead of asking the user to understand all of this, because the reality is it's way too complicated for an average person to really understand and to make these choices. Just probably to give you an idea, we worked on Facebook for 9 years. I cannot tell you fully how Facebook works, but the idea is still that people should be able to read that, like an 70-year-old mom who wants to see pictures of their kids or whatever should be able to read all of this and understand it, which is, I don't think, very realistic as an approach to privacy. No matter that people should still be informed as much as possible, but I just don't think it's gonna cut it in the end in all ways.
David Reichel, you had your hand up there while Max was speaking, so let's bring you in.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's very interesting input I'm hearing, and I mean, I would also like to point to the numbers. I mean, as we said before, so it's 1 in 3 is not reading, and of those reading, 27% are not understanding, which adds up to half of the population either not reading or not understanding what they're doing. And I mean, I hear from your interventions, of course, that there is a variety across different people, and these are also some patterns, as I mentioned before, we see in the results, so that there is a gender difference observable when it comes to data protection. We also saw in the discussion yesterday, when it comes to general knowledge on human rights related issues, that it's especially disadvantaged people in the society, those difficulties with making the ends meet, also understanding or having awareness of their rights. And then, of course, we also have the variation across countries. And this also links to what you said, Wojciech, also that, of course, now we're in the crisis and the data were collected before. And I think this way the data give a good baseline for discussion, because during the crisis, I think people might change their minds quite quickly, depending on what the numbers are reported on TV. So based on the numbers we have at hand, and I'm wondering also, like, to what extent, because as you said, Max, that it shouldn't shift on the people, but I think it should inform policy actions in the direction, if they shouldn't be general, but more targeted to certain groups and also to certain areas. Me working on artificial intelligence, where it's really difficult for many people to understand what you're actually consenting to. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Now, I'm going to stay with this topic just for a moment, because I said Clayton Hamilton of the WHO does have to leave us at round about 11. So, Clayton, I think there's one thing, it's not entirely data protection and fundamental rights, but the tracing app is something that's in the headlines all the time, and it is being described by some governments as a game changer. This will solve our problem. Could you put that aspect of it, its actual role in public health, into context for us, so that when people are downloading, they understand in health terms kind of what it can do and what it can't do?
Thanks, Imogen. And yes, I think that's an extremely important perspective to bring into this discussion. So to really make sure that we understand what we're talking about here. So digital contact tracing is this emerging technological approach to traditional contact tracing that utilizes this inbuilt Bluetooth functionality on the smartphones that many of us are carrying around to record these proximity interactions between individuals for the purpose of limiting transmission of COVID-19. So if we dig deep into it, the working hypothesis of digital contact tracing is that community transmission of COVID-19 could be substantially slowed with the aid of a system to automate the human contact tracing process by rapidly identifying and alerting those people who have been in close proximity to an individual who at a later point in time tests positive. So the key objective and the key public health objective of digital contact tracing is reducing the time between the proven primary infection and the identification of potential secondary cases in order to interrupt the chain of transmission. Now, what makes this more pertinent is the high number of asymptomatic COVID-19 cases and the large volume of suspected and confirmed cases. These are important drivers in introducing digital solutions to support national contact tracing teams. as is, admittedly, the highly limited amount of human contact tracing resources in countries to adequately address scenarios of rapid propagation of disease. So we're really here looking at a matter of resources and time. We know that most member states are doing manual contact tracing. However, this process is not perfect, and there is a scope to do better. This is where apps come into the picture. We may not remember who we sat next to in public, on the bus or on the train. We may not know who we're standing next to in the supermarket. And there are issues with recall as well. Recollection is particularly difficult for those individuals, interestingly, who are asymptomatic. So apps can address this gap. There's also the perspective that individuals may not want to give up close contacts for fear of guilt or recrimination. I would also say that governments are also seeking a range of different means to support now in the easing of the public health and social measures, and essentially to kickstart economic activity once again. So digital contact tracing is certainly seen as an important factor within that context as well. Over.
Thank you very much. And I think that puts it to a certain extent in perspective for us, that it's a complementary tool, but it can't replace what countries are having to get on with now, which is the hard graft of tracing and tracking and following up and testing and tracing and tracking and following up again. Cornelia Kutterer now, because we want to move on to another aspect of the research, and that is to do with facial recognition. Now, interestingly, I hear that you and Human Rights in Geneva are about to publish a report on this later this afternoon, exactly on the aspects of new digital technology and the protection of human rights, particularly in political protests. Now, our survey shows that 17% of people would be willing to share their facial image with public authorities, just 6% with private companies though. And that 31% of internet users, that's basically all of us these days, think that companies, commercial companies, advertisers will use the data that they shared for commercial purposes without the individual's permission. So a first question, I mean, were you surprised by these findings? And there's an apparent lack of trust there, particularly about facial recognition technology.
Thank you, Imogen. First of all, let me thank the Fundamental Rights Agency for inviting Microsoft to this panel. We are thrilled to participate in here, and also thanks to the supporters of that event. I want to say that in particular, the introductory remarks from State Secretary Jens Frølich Holte were absolutely spot on for this discussion. And before I go into the specifics of one certain artificial intelligence technology, let me at least say that what we learned from this public health crisis is that data is indispensable to address this. So we have learned quite a bit over the couple of last month. We could almost say that the digital transformation that would have happened in the next 2 years happened in the last 2 months. In getting businesses, public administrations, and societies, and as a mother of 3 schools, online to continue daily activities. In this context, Microsoft's role has been broad, and we have in particular worked a lot with first responders, working with hospitals and public administrations to address the first reactions, just like, for example, providing chatbots to hospitals so they can manage the increased demand for information during the crisis of concerned citizens. We're working with the World Health Organization to create a global data platform for governments to plug in and retrieve data they need. So this is a broader context in which the discussion has to take place as background. And of course, there is no doubt about it, but it can only proceed, and we can only benefit from the advantages of the technology in retrieving insights from data if trust is established. So we as a company are absolutely fundamentally looking at trust in this context. So this acceleration of digital transformation, in our view, will remain, and it will in particular accelerate in the context of artificial intelligence. Now, going to the one part of artificial intelligence, facial recognition, I think it is an interesting outcome that aligns very well with how GDPR has really looked at biometrics data. So I'm not surprised to see a very big alignment between, for example, political beliefs and the concerns that people express, as well as facial recognition or biometrical identification in this context. There is, in a way, it's a proof point that GDPR got it right to say these are really sensitive data sets and require a specific treatment within GDPR. Hence, with GDPR, but also with our fundamental rights considerations, I think Europe has already a very stringent framework to deal with facial recognition technologies. Now, facial recognition technologies depends on the use case. You have, of course, verification. So your iPhone will be opened with your face. Is a different use scenario than if, and this is the public debate we are having with the white paper on AI that the European Commission has published to discuss precisely this, whether biometrics data or identification should be used by law enforcement in public spaces. So we also need to dig a little bit deep into what are people concerned about and what are the topics that we want to address and how. There are some analogies, I think, between the tracing discussion we are having and the discussion we are having on facial recognition. They go to the core of the fundamental rights. And when something is, and Max knows this very well because he has led to European court decisions that were very clearly deciding that there is a situation where the core of a right is infringed and where then there is no justification possible. So we will have to really fine-tune and understand when are we actually talking about a right that is in its core infringed and cannot be justified, and where that is not the case, is it proportional, is it necessary, and what are the specific safeguards we need to put in place in order to make sure that the rights of citizens are not infringed. I think the frameworks that the Fundamental Rights Charter and the Human Rights Convention provide us in Europe are a fantastic basis to fine-tune and have this public discussion. As State Secretary Jens Frølich Holte said, the dilemma is eventually not a dilemma when we base our discussions on these fundamental rights.
Cornelia, thank you very much. Now, as you know, we have reactions also to this survey coming from officials and human rights activists across Europe who've been sending in video messages. And we have a couple to listen to now before we go back to our discussion. So let's take a look at what two very well-known human rights defenders in Europe have to say.
Humans and machines are living in an ever closer relationship. Ensuring that technological development works for and not against human rights, democracy, and the rule of law is therefore one of the biggest tasks that states must face. I congratulate FRA for putting a renewed spotlight on the intricate links between data protection, digital technology, and human dignity. Technology is never neutral. It is very personal because it carries ethical, political, and legal implications. Digital technologies can improve the quality of our lives, increase efficiency, strengthen accountability, create new opportunities in many key sectors of life, like healthcare, education, and employment. And it can, of course, strengthen human rights protection in a variety of ways.
Some say that the right to privacy is dead. Luckily, the survey from the Fundamental Rights Agency shows that the rumors of its death are highly exaggerated. In fact, citizens of the Union show good knowledge about the right to privacy and also a great amount of trust in our governments when it comes to the handling of personal data. Governments should, of course, take care of this trust, especially when it comes to contact tracing apps. We've seen citizens raise quite a lot of concerns in terms of privacy and the collection of unnecessary data. Trust is earned, and so if citizens raise these concerns, governments should, of course, listen. This is especially true in the face of a common enemy such as the pandemic, in which human rights should be front and center of any and all efforts which the government pushes through, both in relation to today, but also for any other future pandemics we might see.
Oh, two videos, two well-known faces there. Wojciech, we heard Dunja Mijatović say that technology is never neutral. We heard Marya Akhtar say that trust has to be earned in technology. Now, as we heard earlier, 69% of people in the EU have heard about GDPR, 71% about National Data Protection Authority. But what about the ones who haven't? What problems do you see people facing if they're not aware of their rights? Given, as Cornelia just said, you know, we've made advances in the use of digital technology in leaps and bounds over the last 2 months to cope with this pandemic.
I think the most important problem that we have is that if you don't know what are your personal rights, the trust is the only thing you have. So it's then 0-1. That's binary. Then you either trust or you don't. You don't have any ways to check it. You have no plan actually how to deal with it. So you either oppose everything which is done either by the companies or by the governments, or you have to agree, even if you don't like it, even if you don't think that it's fair. So in this sense, the role of the data protection authorities, but also the civic society organizations, is to make the people aware. We don't want them to use their rights, to ask for the access to the data whenever they know that somebody stores this data. No, but they will want them to have this opportunity. So this is like with taking the holidays and traveling around. You don't force the people to travel. You don't force the people to have to introduce into the tourism business. But you want them to have a right to that and to have the possibility to travel. So that's more or less what we do with the privacy as well. We don't mind if the people say we trust our government and we think that they know better how to deal with the things. When I approach the plane, I really think that the fact that it flies is magical. You know, I was taught how to measure the possibility of a plane to fly, but I still can't believe in it. But I know that there is somebody who is checking it, who is controlling that there is some system to deal with the fact that it's secure and that's the tool that I can use. And that's probably the place where I'm not, the trust is the only thing I can take. But coming back to the privacy, coming back to data protection, I think what is very important and what we have to remember as the possibility for the people to check is what is the purpose the data is collected, and is the way it is compatible with this purpose. That was the part of the discussion that we had in Norway last days, where the Data Protection Authority found that it's very hard to say that the purpose the data is collected have been actually achieved by the contact tracing app. I'm one of
I think we've perhaps lost you again, Wojciech. It says, this is the difficulty with virtual debate.
I'm sorry.
You're back.
I'm sorry very much. Yes, I'm back. There has to be some problem with the internet in my neighborhood.
Yes.
So just finishing with it. As I said, we should know what the data is collected for and what it is used for. I'm definitely one of the first persons to download the contact tracing app, but I'm also one of the first person to ask, do you really know what you are collecting this data for and what is it used for?
Okay, thank you very much. Max Schrems, I'm assuming that your internet connection is stratospheric, you being in the business that you're in. We are talking about people who undoubtedly use new technology, use apps, you have smartphones, but don't know entirely how they work. So they don't know what's happening with the data. You touched on this before in your earlier answer. Well, one of the findings in the survey is that 1 in 5 smartphone users don't actually know how to turn off the location settings. And that among that group, women are less aware than men. Does that say to you that we need a gendered approach to this, or is it more a basic, fundamental, proper education? I mean, you said you yourself still couldn't understand how Facebook worked, that the whole way of divulging this information is far too complicated for your average user.
To be honest, I'm probably the wrong person to ask about these details, but you know, probably a lot of women are just more honest in not knowing what they do here, because we have that usually. I mean, to be honest, like just to give you an idea, we now have 15 people working at NOIP on privacy stuff. We're sitting there every day in meetings and say, you know, how does this really work? We need a tech person to come in. I have calls with big tech companies that tell us, you know, we don't really know which legal basis we use under the GDPR, so we just write all of them in there because we don't know ourselves. So, I mean, that's the reality of even people in the know of privacy. So expecting the average guy at home to kind of really understand these things in detail is just very hard. I mean, obviously setting your privacy, you know, your location settings is something that most people know. But if you go into the details of questions, like, for example, who actually gets my data, I'm wondering if people even realize what they don't know, because, you know, it's the unknown that is kind of hard for people to even conceptualize if they understand that or not. And I think that exactly dives into something that Wojciech has said before as well, is we need experts for these areas. We need a enforcement system where we can just blindly trust that in a certain extent. You just brought the example of an airplane. I usually say, you know, I get on a train, it runs for 200 kilometers an hour. I don't know how this works. Like, to me, it's kind of weird that this thing stays on it, and I don't have to know. I'm just, you know, I basically just want to use these things without having to worry 24/7. I think that is a bit of a path forward, and that could also help a lot for systems like contact tracing. We actually put out the paper rather early on contact tracing, saying that under the GDPR, most of that is perfectly fine. There's legal basis for exactly these things. The big question is how you do it. We heard about, you know, having a privacy-friendly approach, which is doable, which ran into technical issues. But I think overall, this what we have to build in Europe in, let's say, 10 or 20 years is that we generally don't worry about these topics anymore, because we have experts in the companies, in government, and in the bodies that review it, mainly the DPAs right now, that ensure that stuff is just working. Just like with, you know, building codes, with high-speed rail, planes, whatever it is, the average guy does not have to worry about, unless you have a Boeing 737 MAX that apparently someone did not check properly. But that's exactly where we were outraged in this one situation, and could not understand how this could happen. While in the privacy world, we kind of still expect that these planes are just coming down sometimes. And I think we still have a lot to catch up there.
Cornelia and David, you both wanted to come in there. Cornelia, I'll come to you first.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's quite right. But what Max is saying, I just want to eventually level this up a bit. First of all, GDPR is, of course, still a new baby, and there is still a lot of work ongoing. And of course, the European Commission this week has just issued its review report, which was due this year. And you can see that while a success, there is still work in progress, in particular also on guidance that also businesses need from the European Data Protection Board in how to read certain provisions. I also do believe that there is a culture shift necessary both in companies in how to think about GDPR, but also in how to work with companies in advancing the discussions around this. And this will, of course, be exacerbated by new technologies such as artificial intelligence. In the context of artificial intelligence, we are obviously looking not only at GDPR, but the Commission is also reflecting on specific rules that address other areas than personal data protection, such as discrimination. And I'm bringing this up in particular because gender was raised as a topic. It's of course hard to reflect on why this discrepancy exists in the context of the survey that the Fundamental Rights Agency undertook. But generally, it is, I think, also an opportunity where now with the data available, we can actually more holistically address issues. The discussion around tracing apps should never be binary. Clayton has already addressed some of these issues, like there are certain populations that will not have those apps. I did a small survey in my family, and fun enough, my sister has not downloaded the German app because her smartphone is not new enough. You can think of her being more sustainable aware, keeping an app, keeping a phone for a longer period of time. It's an aspect. My brother, on the other hand, has immediately downloaded the app. So the artificial intelligence and data insights give us also an opportunity to more holistically approach issues, so that we don't have to talk about dilemmas between one and the other right, but we look at certain problems in a more holistic way. So in the context of tracing apps, I think Microsoft itself has been more focused on principles that we believe should be underlying the use of these apps. For example, we have said that decentralized systems are certainly more privacy enhancing than centralized systems. Then at the same time, there's a recognition that it's not a panacea. It is much more a part of a broader concept in how to respond to these crises. And it's not only about the tracing app itself, but it's about other tools that can be used, including non-digital solutions as well. So my plea here is really to take the opportunity of the situation and take a lot of learnings from that. I think one that I'm keenly interested is that location data is really very scenario specific, and in the results of the study have very clearly shown that people are very sensitive when it comes to location data. So that should give us some insights in how it is dealt with in the new law GDPR, but also in other laws that are still currently discussed at EU level.
Thanks, Cornelia. David, you wanted to come in as well.
Thank you. Now, I wanted to react to points that I heard from previous speakers. And for Wojciech, you gave the very interesting, good example, like when it comes to trust and the airplane. And I also used to think about electricity sometimes, where I forgot from high school actually how this works. But I trust that people who are doing this know how this do, because standardization and processes are developed. Of course, in the area of artificial intelligence, which is developing so quickly, we don't have these standards yet. And many people are frantically working on developing this. And Cornelia was mentioning the important political processes at the European Commission level, also at the Council of Europe, looking into how this can be addressed from a human rights perspective. The second point I heard from several of you, and I think it's important to pick up, is the purpose of using personal data, and also the context. We had Cornelia, you spoke a bit about the facial recognition technology issue, and also the data we had. And FRA published a report in November last year on facial recognition technology in the context of law enforcement. And I mean, one of the main points we had to make was that we actually don't know exactly what the purpose will be for many law enforcement agencies to use the data, who would be put on watch lists. And I mean, this is, I think, even more important that we add some context to the discussions when using new technologies, also in the context of contact tracing apps. And the survey data show this stark difference between private companies and governments, for example. And this already gives us a first indication of context. So for governments, it's easier than for companies. But of course, if you ask people a blanket question like this, there's a resounding no from people. And this quite quickly might go against the core or the essence of your right to privacy. But the point is that we did a lot of work already on facial recognition technology. We can also use the lessons learned in this area for discussions, which are linked now to the crisis. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I wanted to ask maybe all of you actually, but I was also interested in the point that Wojciech and Max made, that we trust that the plane works. And with this data and new technology and artificial intelligence, I just really wonder, Max, you said in 20 years we should have like the legislation to trust that it all works and we're all protected. Honestly, I'm a bit skeptical. I mean, if we see, I'm looking particularly at the private, the Facebooks, etc. of the world. They are just racing ahead. Legislation is creeping afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, I actually see that a bit more as a mixed picture. If we look at stuff like that, it's similar in the environmental, protection world, in workers' rights and so on. The Industrial Revolution totally came, much quicker than any workers' rights. But over time, we realized that there is an issue and that we need to tackle it, and we managed. And none of these fights are final. Like, we still talk about, I don't know, being at airplanes, having air crews that don't have a collective bargaining agreement and work for less than at McDonald's. These fights are never going to be done. But I think fundamentally that there is a basic trust that, your wages are paid and so on, is something that we have achieved. And I think it's also interesting that we don't necessarily call for legislation that much, at least when it comes to the GDPR world. I mean, artificial intelligence, obviously, we don't have anything yet. But I think the other problem that we have in Europe and that we have to face, and probably which triggered my interest in privacy in the beginning, is the question if we actually enforce these things too. And when I studied in California, the joke was still, if you're in Europe, they have wonderful fundamental rights, but if you break the law, you make a profit and you go again and nothing happens. And it's unfortunate that after the GDPR, at least in some member states, we see the same problem happening again. We don't have a single decision in Ireland yet. We still have, Google was just confirmed now with 50 million as the biggest fine ever, but we all know that 50 million for Google is laughable. So the reality is still that we have to beef up, if we want to take these fundamental rights seriously, the enforcement bit. And I think it's right now a bit too easy oftentimes to just call for the legislator to kind of pass another piece of paper, and so on. But we also have to really use what we have right now, which is by no means perfect, don't get me wrong. Like, the GDPR is probably the least stupid privacy law we have in the world right now, but definitely not the best. But I think we'll have to go into that much more. We're definitely working on that to kind of come up with stuff like class actions and so on that can have a civil society element that adds to it. But I think that's where, if we dive into that, we can probably get a lot of stuff done in very little time and move there. But as I said, I think the realistic time scenario that we walk out and feel like, okay, our privacy is really protected is probably in 20 years or something like that, realistically. But we have to start working now. It's a bit like with climate changers, so just not probably we can still change that later too. But it's definitely not something that happens overnight, especially if companies get the feeling that nothing really happens anyways.
Cornelia, you are going to come in just a moment because I saw your hand up. What I wanted to say to our viewers out there is that you can submit questions via Slido, and we've had one come in already, which I'm going to come to. But first, Cornelia, your point.
Yes, I just want to respond to Max on one point. Of course, artificial intelligence is a technology that is not outside of rule of law, and the challenge that we are having is now to really fine-tune which areas are well covered and where eventually gaps exist. Microsoft has definitely for a while said we need to enact specific laws, in particular for high-risk scenarios, and we have therefore supported also the European Commission's approach to looking at a framework for artificial intelligence in Europe. And I invite everybody to read our submission, which is online on our Microsoft.eu website. I think we are taking an approach that takes humans and citizens into the center. And that's not such an easy task when you're actually implementing this in an AI governance structure internally, where you have a lot of engineers that now have to rethink how they build technology. They need to really think from the start and envision what type of technology they create and how does that impact people, not only those for whom they create the technology, but also those who might be impacted by the technology. And that requires a lot of internal work and AI governance around the development of the technology. It also requires us to work with our customers that use the technology in which uses do we actually want them to take it forward with, and where would we be uncomfortable. But around all of that, which we are currently doing as a company, a framework around that is absolutely necessary, which requires really everybody to understand the dogma change that we are undergoing with this technology, but also the cultural opportunity that we have in applying the technology in the best way for our society.
Thank you very much. And indeed, we have got more questions coming in. And as I suspected, us being in the situation that we're in, a lot of them are focused on data privacy, data protection, and public health. So we have one. I think I'll put it to you first, Wojciech, and then Max, I saw you had your hand up, so I'll come to you as well. Shouldn't health and lives override data privacy regulations? What do you think?
Well, I hope we don't need to answer the question like that. I think that we can have both at the same time. So there is no permanent conflict between them. There's no permanent the permanent necessity to weigh which is more important, which is less important. They are both important. Of course, we know that the personal security and the winning of life and winning of being healthy is something that we put in front as the most important need. So we should observe how to keep the privacy at the same time. And if we decide that there should be some changes, some extraordinary measures to be taken, we have to bear in mind that they should be used in the extraordinary time. So they should be temporary. We should know what we do. We should know who is doing that. We should know for which purpose and not use them for the other purposes than the health purpose. and we should know the way out. So we should know what is the sunsetting solution, and how we will go back to something which is normal. And I guess that the law that we have in Europe, including GDPR and e-privacy regulation, e-privacy directive, are ready to face these challenges.
Max, you wanted to come in as well.
Yeah, just probably catching up on that question and what Wojciech just said. I think that's exactly the interesting part of the GDPR. It actually foresees epidemics as a reason to process data, and the GDPR literally does not foresee a lot of more realistic scenarios. So it was kind of interesting for us that actually this situation is foreseen as possible, and I don't see that conflict either. It's more of a question of how to do it, about the principles of data minimization. You know, you can do open source stuff that people can actually check it. You can do all the privacy by design. So I think this conflict, if you actually look at it a bit closer, does not exist that much. Getting back on what Cornelia said before, I don't think that the whole AI debate is kind of what I wanted to get to. I think if we look at the topic for this panel, at least, what I was surprised about is if we have really useful, you know, human-centric technology like these tracing apps, why are people so afraid to use it? And I think the bottom line is that there is a negative stomach feeling that is generated over the years, that people probably don't understand in detail what is done with their data, but they do have a stomach feeling that they are somehow screwed. and this then transpires over to a very useful app as well. And I think that is exactly where I'm oftentimes kind of, you know, really kind of sad about that, because certain players do not really try to have like privacy-friendly systems. This kind of infects the whole industry. That infects very useful technology as well, because people don't understand these details of the GDPR that we can probably all talk about. But they do have a stomach feeling of, do I trust an app that says tracking on my phone? and then the answer was pretty much no, even though in Austria, for example, it was provided by the Red Cross, which is probably the last organization you think about as being like the terrible, you know, privacy undermining authority or organization. But I think we have to combat this mistrust, and that's a much broader goal that we all have to find in the long run. I think that's more, you know, probably independent from AI or so.
Cornelia, you had your hand up, and David, I'd like to, because we're getting close to the end, I'd also like to bring you in again. But I mean, I could say from my own point of view, why people are distrusting. It's not because they distrust the Austrian Red Cross. It's where that data goes. Yeah. We all know we search for one thing online, and before you know it, something similar has popped up on our mobile phone offering it for sale. We've all seen things related to votes and elections and data harvesting, which makes us very, very nervous. So I think that's it. It may not be logical, but I'm a journalist. These things are in the news. We pay attention to them. Cornelia.
Yeah, and you see now we are already having a lot of very different personal views on the topic, and I want to share mine here. As a German citizen, I can relate a lot to surveys that we did across the world on privacy perceptions. And the one interesting one that stuck out, but I could totally relate to, was the German one, where there was this: as long as they trust governments, as long as the government doesn't change, as long as the regime doesn't change. And I think the what we see worldwide with the use of these type of technologies are such that as long as in the current situation we're talking about public health authorities in democratic societies, where the rule of law still operates under democratic governance, people trust. But of course, we are in a world where, unfortunately, undemocratic governance is on the rise, and so where as a German with the German history, I think we can relate to this: as long as the regime doesn't change. And we need to sort of have this also in mind. In my sense, the reluctance to words like tracing and surveillance are definitely related to that too, and it is an important part of the debate in how to create systems that are strong, but they cannot only be solved in an app and in the design of the app. This is a much broader and wider discussion that we need to have at the same time.
David Reichel, I wanted to bring you in there, so we're close to the end, because you know all the data from this survey, maybe a little bit your reaction to the comments, but also I'm just wondering, did any kind of reasons for the lack of trust emerge from your survey? Do you have any whys to go with the, half of people don't want to do this, only 17% are interested in facial recognition, that kind of thing?
Thank you. As I mentioned before, I think what we clearly hear is there is a lack of trust when you ask a general question on data use. And this is why it makes the context so important. And what we learned from the data is also the importance of context. For example, the difference between governments and business that we heard, also across socio-demographics. And so here we answering general questions like, can we use this for this without any further content, is just really difficult. And I think we need to do a better job in addressing these concerns, and only this way can also gain the trust. FRA is also publishing monthly bulletins around the fundamental rights issues on the COVID-19 crisis. And the second one dealt with contact tracing apps. And what we found is that there was a lack of in-depth analysis in countries when it comes to the development of these apps. And I think here we surely need to do a better job and just use the data, information that is available, also use the great laws that we have in the EU, like the GDPR, the non-discrimination laws, which we have available and which safeguard our fundamental rights. And this way we can also do a better job.
Okay, thank you very much. So I have one last question to our three remaining panelists, and then we are going to be out of time. I'm going to sum up, because we've had a lot of questions coming in, and they're all about the app. That's what everybody's thinking about, clearly. So I'm going to tie it up with what was going to be my closing question anyway, which is about key things to overcome this lack of trust. So we have one question. How do we restore faith in the COVID-19 apps? We have another, are governments sharing this data with anybody else, including other European governments? And what about these non-official, non-governmental COVID apps? What's happening with that data, and what should we do about that? So again, you see a kind of quite broad spectrum of concern, but it's all about, I think I should do this, but I'm not very comfortable with it. And I think that applies to an awful lot of new technology now, whether it's the Alexa or the smart car, or in this case the app. So we'll start first with you, Wojciech, then Cornelia, and then finally Max. What key thing do you think we could do to restore trust? Wojciech, you have disappeared again.
Yeah, but it's but I'm okay. I'm back. Okay. I simply unmuted and closed my video connection at the same time with one finger. Okay, just very shortly, because of course the question is extremely large. First of all, because there are different kinds of apps that are offered at the moment. So I really cannot answer at the same time for the question about the state-organized tracing app and another apps that are on the market which are also dealing with the COVID, because the second scope is really extremely large. And even talking about the mHealth apps which are right now available, the answer would require well, probably the other conference to be done. So let's stick only to the contact tracing apps. First of all, we should know what is going on. Once the code is open and everybody around, including Max Schrems and Cornelia's Kutterer, can check what is going on there, it's much better than if it's closed and we cannot see what is it. Secondly, if it's offered by the government, ask the government, make them accountable for the fact that they are giving the license to that, and ask your data protection authority. They have to know. If they are not allowed to check this app, they should say that they are not allowed. That will be the problem. If they are in, just check only if they are giving the real answer of the data protection authority, or this is just the transmission of the governmental position.
Cornelia.
Yes, so I don't think that I'm in a position to give advice after Wojciech, who on the topic. But let me say we are not developing those apps. We have focused on principles that I think align very much with what we have seen from the eHealth network, coming out of the eHealth network, comments and opinions from the EDPS. What I found most important, besides the open source and what I already mentioned, the most privacy-focused decentralized versions, is certainly the public engagement. Of course, we can't expect everybody to become a software engineer to understand what's exactly happening in those apps, but it is an important aspect that I think in some governments have been done really well in actually having a public discourse around the topic. Another aspect that I'd say is extremely important in order to align with the core fundamental principles that I mentioned before is there needs to be a clear end date to this. People need to understand when and why and what happens with the data thereafter. So these are additional aspects, if I can say those.
Max Schrems, it's about restoring trust.
Yeah, I mean, we really had a hard time because I was like walking around. I just pulled it up here. It's probably hard to read, but that's the Austrian app. I have it on my phone itself. And it was interesting because, media was like asking me to criticize it, and were kind of surprised that I was like, it's actually well done. You can do that. It's doable. I think there are a couple of elements that were touched upon already, that, it's got to be open source. It's got to be non-centralized. But for example, it's also a question if you cannot have anonymous tracking because you need to find that person after all, so it's usually pseudonymous. But that is possible, that you basically just have a random ID. I think there is an interesting element if a trusted third party like the Red Cross in Austria runs the system, so it's not the government, but in this case a private NGO, which could help that people accept it. One thing that you were touching on was private apps. I think there is one big problem with these private apps is we saw that the results that are medically helpful only work if an app is perfectly tied into the national tracking, tracing, testing system. So we still have huge issues on that, I think, in most member states and countries. And if we want to kind of be prepared for the second wave, we would need to have a system that directly ties you into the national testing system, that gives you the spot, that tells you where to go, that kind of gives you the answer right away, that also verifies, for example, that if someone claims that they're corona positive, that is actually tested, and somehow there is a token given out by the government saying, okay, you actually got a positive test, so that even allows you to activate the app. So there's a lot of really interaction, if you do it properly, that you need between the government system of how we do public health and such an app. So I think that is an element why these government-run apps, if they're done well, are usually preferable, because it's all about the tracing is all about shortening the time lag between knowing that you're infected and actually the time that you inform other people. And if that is not tied directly into each other, you lose exactly the time that you should win with these apps after all.
Okay, thank you very much. That brings us sadly to the end of this debate. Really, really interesting. And just while you were all talking that last question, I was thinking, is this maybe the silver lining of this pandemic, and that has actually forced us to think very hard, particularly about this subject, about data and how we use it, whether, you know, how we use it for the public good and still protect our individual rights, our fundamental rights, and our privacy. And I think I know that the survey from the Fundamental Rights Agency has contributed to that. Hopefully our debate has as well. So let me just thank first all our panelists, Wojciech Wiewiórowski, Clayton Hamilton, who had to leave earlier. Norway, Jens, thank you for being there with us. Max Schrems, Cornelia Kutterer, of course, David Reichel. And let us thank once again Croatia and Norway for their cooperation. Quick reminder, what I talked about earlier, there is the film that you can watch, Democracy in a Blizzard of Data. I think there's a slide coming up right now, in fact, about how you can watch that. Well worth a look, particularly in the context of our debate. Finally, just finally, we'll look again. We started yesterday with views from people across Europe about fundamental rights and how they should be protected. And we have various videos, so we'll just play them out. In the meantime, thank you to the Fundamental Rights Agency. Thank you to all of us for joining us. And we hope that you enjoyed the debate.
A finding I found challenging, if not surprising, in the Fundamental Rights Agency's survey is that a full third of Europeans believe that the only people who benefit from human rights are those who don't deserve them, such as criminals or terrorists, and that number goes up to 44% amongst those who find it difficult to make ends meet. To me, that illustrates a fundamental failing in terms of how we've engaged with people around rights. We need to move beyond legal abstractions to really illustrate in concrete terms that human rights are the lifeblood of our day-to-day existences, that they're the backbone of our jobs, of our housing, of our education, and that they're part of what's keeping us safe during this pandemic. That a rights-respecting society is one that will afford greater benefits for all people and their children going forward, that it will make us all safer and more secure, even when those rights are being afforded to people who are accused of crimes or accused of terrorism.
To me, the most striking finding of this report is the perceived discrepancy between human rights ideals and political practice and implementation. Nearly 9 out of 10 people in the EU find that human rights are important for creating fairer societies, whereas 6 out of 10 people find that politicians do not care about them. And this perception is all the more prevalent among the socially disadvantaged. This points to a need for politicians in the EU to better demonstrate their commitment to human dignity, equality, and non-discrimination, not least in socioeconomic terms. The socioeconomic impact of the pandemic, recent protests against racism, also here in the EU, as well as the urgent need to shift the global economy towards sustainability, points to an urgent need for us all to overcome the discrepancies that this report points to.
Judiciary is one of the 3 pillars of a democratic state. Executive power, legislative power, and judiciary have to control each other without dominating each other. However, it's a fact that the legislative power and executive power have become more intertwined, and the executive power has grown. This brings with it an imbalance. It is now an alarming signal to read that 1 out of 4 EU citizens has the impression that a judge rarely or never does a job out of influence from the government. This not only shows lack of trust, but also a lack of structural independence of our systems, not only in those systems which are anyway in the spotlight, unfortunately. We have to stand up to protect our independence, we have to stand up to disclose structural deficits, and we have to stand up for our European colleagues in need.
My major concern with the results of this year's Fundamental Rights Survey is about political intimidation and independence of the judiciary. The results are striking. 21% of the people in the European Union think that NGOs and charities are never or rarely able to do their work free from government intimidation, and 27% believe that judges are never able to do their job free from government influence. The findings of the survey fully support our observations from the past several years in my own country, Bulgaria, and in several other East European states. The EU should take these unfortunate developments very seriously and should deal with them through a series of monitoring, legislative, and financial measures. Europe cannot take pride of its democratic culture and promote it outside of its borders if it is unable to address these serious problems within member states.
What I find important about this research is that it confirms that society isn't just divided into two groups of people who are pro-human rights and anti-human rights. What the research results suggest is that actually a lot of people have conflicting views about human rights. Sometimes they're in favour of human rights and sometimes they're against them. And this group actually seems to be the biggest group in society. We need to do two things about this. First, we need to find out much more about this movable middle. How is it that they think about human rights? What is it that they are worried about? And the second thing that we need to do is to learn to communicate much more effectively than we are at the moment. So we need to know how to speak about human rights in a way that resonates with people's values. Authoritarians have been doing this very effectively for quite a number of years. We need to play catch up.
I thought that would be a good backdrop to say something about the survey. The survey talks about human rights being under threat. The findings being a wake-up call. Strong words. What can we do? The data also show a very large majority favoring human rights. There are, of course, a number of people more skeptical, but they're a minority. It's really a question of silent majority versus loud minority. That's a very good starting point. We need, as human rights professionals, to help verbalize what the majority in our society wants. How can we do that? I'm a huge fan of what the FRA does with its fundamental rights communication work. We need to apply that to this data. We need to help unsilence the majority.
We welcome this report that highlights once again that for us persons with disability, a lot of European countries do not enough to inform people of their rights. Information is also only useful when we can act on it. We need accessibility, we need countries to dismantle residential institutions where disabled persons are deprived of their rights to live independently in the community with the adequate support they need. Above this, they need to proactively guarantee our rights. And also the system of claiming our rights is so complicated that it's discouraging us. And even when people complain, they feel that not enough is done to redress and to prevent for the future. So the need to truly improve public and private services and support is crucial for us to lead an independent life in the society on equal level as all other European citizens, without having to fight constantly for our rights. Thank you.
What struck me the most in this report is that half of the young people across Europe seem to be willing today to resort on low-level bribery, such as giving a favor or a gift to a public authority in order to receive a particular service, be it medical or administrative. This finding epitomizes the slippery slope our European societies are making these days. We individually and collectively accept to trade money and favors for convenience. Yet corruption affects each and every of us, and favoring a patient over another, educating a citizen over another one, means to make our society and ourselves poorer. To change that, the good lobby strives to equalize access to power by popularizing the many avenues of participation that enable everyone to constructively interact with decision makers and ultimately holding them into account. Time has come to lobby for change.
President of the European Youth Forum, what struck me most to read in the report was
that young people seem to pay less importance to certain factors of democracy. But I think it's also important that we look into the bigger picture, because we also know that while conventional politics might not work for young people, we are also at the forefront of youth movements driving our society for change. So what should we do to really allow young people to fully engage politics? I have 3 suggestions. The first one would be that we finally need to start talking about topics that are interested and of concern for young people. Secondly, we should lower the voting age to 16. And thirdly, we must ensure that political education is also part of the school curriculum. So these are my 3 suggestions to really youth up our society.
Hello, my name is Mary. I'm a Spaniard, and during COVID-19 pandemic, I work in the front line as an assistant nurse. Earlier in my life, I benefit from the Don Bosco social services, where I have experienced the respect given to minorities in my country. However, there are many people who doesn't enjoy these human rights completely in Spain, especially during the pandemic. Even more people, not only minority, had no salaries, no social benefits, lack of access to healthcare, and children haven't access to education because the digital gap. For this reason, Don Bosco Social Services has provided for the first time food program support and bought computer and devices and developed education activities with children and families in extreme need.
Hi, my name is Daryl, and I'm a youth worker and a social worker from the Netherlands. And if you would ask me how the youth regarding their civil rights, their primary rights, could be as much as supported, let's face it, we need to change a lot. We need to diversify, especially European institutions as well. I know for a fact that the majority in there and up there is not looking like me. And that's exactly the problem when it comes to specific youth regarding their ethnicity and race and their socioeconomic status. Let's not forget that only putting people in place of color will not solve the issues they have. They need to be represented in embodiment, but also by policy. So we need all genders up there. We need especially women of color there, all religions, every religion possible, every ethnicity possible should be represented in order to create and forge a collective voice in order to speak out and to understand our youth nowadays.